Okay, just give me a signal when you're ready. Okay. So my name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I'd like to welcome you here today for our meeting of July 9th. This is our regular Saturday meeting of the Manhattan Project. Usually we have Mr. Lyndon LaRouche with us. We do not have him with us today. We're going to open today with a statement from Diane Sare of the LaRouche Policy Committee. And I may or may not add a couple things just after Diane. Otherwise, we'll proceed directly to the Q&A, and I think everybody knows how that works. Our microphone's right here in the center, and you state a question, keep it relatively short. We'll respond, and then if there's necessary follow-up, we'll take that. So, Diane?
Thanks. I just want to reiterate, people who've been following our website have now seen this in your morning report, and you heard it in LaRouche's own words last night on the webcast. But a discussion he had with members of the policy committee and some of our intelligence team on preparation for the webcast on Thursday. He said the Manhattan system is ready to be used. It needs to be used. Setting a rolling movement throughout the United States. We can probably take this thing. And he said the question on the table is Obama going to bomb the world? Or is he going to give up? Or something else in the middle? Part of the context for this was the Chilcot Commission report about Tony Blair, which people may be familiar with, where basically what's now out in the open is that Blair was guilty of launching and organizing a war of aggression. A war of aggression is a crime under the Nuremberg statutes. It's against the United Nations resolutions. It's a violation of international law. War is only to be used as a means of last resort, and what the Chilcot Commission found is it wasn't the last resort. In other words, it wasn't necessary. And Tony Blair is actually destroyed. And in fact, I'll just grab this. The London, yes, the London Guardian had an article Thursday with the headline, "The war in Iraq was not a blunder or a mistake, it was a crime." And the first sentence is, "Tony Blair is damned." We have seen establishment whitewashes in the past, from Bloody Sunday to Hillsborough. Officialdom has repeatedly conspired to smother the truth in the interest of the powerful, but not this time. The Chilcot inquiry was becoming a satirical byword for taking farcically long to execute a task, but Sir John will surely go down in history for delivering the most comprehensively devastating verdict on any modern prime minister. And it goes on to discuss all of the calamities that have befallen mankind as a result of this unnecessary, illegal war of aggression, including these 60 million refugees. So Blair is finished, and that's the question, is Obama finished? That's the context in which LaRouche was asking, will Obama launch thermonuclear war? Will he give up, or will he do something in the middle? And he said, we have to shut this down. We have to shut this war drive down. We have to shut it down now. We have to push hard. He said, what we have an obligation is to create a new economic system to contribute to the needs of the population of the United States and elsewhere. And then he asked, are the American people prepared to reassemble themselves, to reconsider their destiny? And I think that is really the question before all of us, because what is our destiny? What do you think your destiny is? Why should you reconsider it? And I had said last night on the policy committee, the webcast, it occurred to me that Alexander Hamilton grew up in a colony, British, Dutch, sugar plantation, slavery colony in the Caribbean, comes to the United States, and the United States is a colony. Not that there aren't people here, extremely important people like Benjamin Franklin and the Mathers and others with profound ideas, but no nation has been created. And Alexander Hamilton has already in his mind an idea of what the future should be and what the idea of a republic should be, which is based on a conception of what it means to be a human being, the question of the dignity of man. So I think these things that Mr. LaRouche put on the table are the most important to be taken up today, and that we in this room representing the Manhattan Project should consider very seriously what he means when he says the Manhattan system is ready to be used, needs to be used, and to set a rolling movement throughout the United States.
Good, so let's go directly to questions.
Okay, hi, this is, for those watching, Alvin again. And I wanted to talk a little bit of what seems to be about this latest incident in Dallas, but not really. And go back to from approximately the time of Columbine, when the organization put out the report on the new violence, and Lynn was very clear in talking about this phenomena that it had to be looked at as a virus that would, over time, continue to mutate. So you could not pin it down or categorize it in any way, but it's something that should be closely monitored. And of course, Lynn and others have been doing that. Now, this latest shockwave, in my view, in interacting with people or even just looking at people, has really, this bombardment on the mind is really having an effect on people. These things are coming closer and closer together, each little different, each a little more deranged, but nevertheless, the population is really, well, I'm not sure how to describe their condition. So that now your mind shuts down. So instead of considering and thinking about what it means for Juno to be over Jupiter, you're shut down. You can't consider that, when the idea of what actually is the potential of mankind gets shut down. So something I think, though, is very interesting is as these things deepen in people, I'm recognizing the ability for them to drop their axioms because of the level of desperation that they have, and realize that they can be creative, that China has taken 600 million people out of poverty over 20 years. And why don't you think about that? How did they do that? How do they continue to grow? And why are we going backwards? Now, these operations and all these things, Lynn has been very clear that you put this at the doorstep, right at the White House, at Obama and the FBI, that these are these type of operations. People are still very frightened about that. But as these incidents continue to mount, they have to then turn to face it. And our role, I think, is indispensable, because I see us more now, particularly with our Coral project in New York, as being a sanctuary now, where they can escape this bombardment and actually realize something within themselves that is useful, and perhaps tap into that. So I wanted to, through this latest incident, relate it to what we're doing, and have you add on to that.
All right, I have a few things, and Dennis has more. We had a discussion with Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche this morning about these matters, but I first think when looking at all of this, you have to think about what's happening right now in the world, which is the NATO summit in Warsaw. And many people know we've been circulating a petition that the US should pull out of NATO that there's no need for NATO as an institution since the Berlin Wall came down, and that NATO has been in violation of all of the agreements which were not in writing between Gorbachev, Bush, after the reunification of Germany. That is, that we were not, that the nations of the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, would be in effect a buffer zone and would not be armed by Russia or NATO. And what we've done in these last weeks is had the largest military exercises ever in these countries involving 50,000 troops. This was done on the 75th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, when the Nazis invaded Russia. And this is continuing, so that coming out of this, there's a rotating battalion, which is going to be in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Canada, Obama went up to Canada. People remember to coerce them into participating. They will take the lead in Latvia, Germany, in Lithuania. Imagine German troops on the border of Russia. The UK, United Kingdom, or it used to be known as Great Britain, but now Mrs. LaRouche calls it Little Britain since the Brexit vote and the end of Tony Blair, will be in Estonia, and the United States will be in Poland. So the backdrop of what you see unfolding in the United States is something extremely alarming. And Russian experts have said, look, this is ridiculous. We know the US, we know this is a bluff because the US and NATO, frankly, our economy is bankrupt. We don't have the economy to launch a ground invasion of Russia. This is stupid. But what they said is, we know that it's a cover for a nuclear first strike. That's what this represents. And that you have people who are advisors to Obama who actually believe, they are so, I can't think of the word, but anyways, they're just so clueless about the real world. Apparently they didn't watch the VJ Day parade in China or the VE Day parade in Russia. They have no idea of the weapons capabilities of China and Russia, which, unlike the US, did not shut down their space programs. And they think that they could launch a first strike, which would obliterate the Russian or Chinese ability to respond. So this is what the type of insanity that you're dealing with. And you have a situation now with China. I think the hearings in The Hague the deadline is July 12th to come up with a ruling on a territorial dispute between China and the Philippines, which, according to international law and every treaty, is supposed to be worked out bilaterally between China and the Philippines, not with the US getting involved in this thing. And that creates a situation for a very dangerous conflict with China. So then go back and look at what happened in the United States this week. And Dennis, I think, should say more about the details about what happened in Dallas, but I will just say that what LaRouche had to say about this, a couple of things. The first thing that came to my mind is Dallas seems to have a history that goes back a little over 50 years of lone assassins. In fact, the location of this incident was only 2 blocks away from where Kennedy was assassinated. And there are many, many questions which we're not going to speculate on, but Mr. LaRouche wants an investigation put together on the highest level to figure out what this is. And I will just say, and we can take this up more in the questions because Dennis should go through what he knows about this. If you think about what we're saying about September 11th and the fact that for 15 years we have not addressed the truth of what was behind that, and that has been kept from us. And you think about what just came out now in the Chilcot Commission inquiry. Imagine the impact if the truth were to be told about who orchestrated 9/11 and what are the networks in the United States that were never dismantled because the truth never came out about what occurred on that day. And is it possible that had the truth been told about that, not only would we not have invaded Iraq, not have overthrown Gaddafi in Libya, not have had the San Bernardino killings, the Orlando killings, the Boston Marathon bombing, and perhaps not this, if that had been known. So I think that's a certain perspective on it, and I'd like Dennis to go ahead more in detail with what we discussed this morning.
Well, what Diane just went through is at the core of what's going on in Dallas, the center of it. The problem we have is that the population and its leadership, so-called, particularly in the Congress and the candidates, is not only cowardly and irresponsible, but is infantile and terrified. What happened was that, among other things, when we were talking to LaRouche this morning, I referenced that I had received a text message before we spoke to him. It was actually night before last, when the Dallas matter had just occurred. Somebody wrote to me and said, "Are you watching Dallas?" And I said, "I don't watch old TV series." I mean, I don't know who shot JR. So how would I know who shot the people in Dallas? When I mentioned this to Mr. LaRouche today, among other things, this wasn't the only thing, but he said, "Look, this is very important." It's very important. It was Dealey Plaza. It's 2 blocks from where Kennedy was also not shot by a lone assassin. And everyone in America knows that. And everybody in Dallas knows that. I referenced to him that one individual had referenced to us that this occurred on the anniversary of the London subway bus bombing, September 7th of 2005. And what we are looking at, we have to recognize, is a certain kind of capability which is not simple. There are 5 policemen dead out of 11 people shot were policemen. And I believe 1 or 2 other people were potentially or possibly were injured by the shooter. That's extraordinary. It's extraordinary shooting. So we have no idea what happened. We also know that, and this is not important to dwell on, but that the ostensible shooter was dispatched, shall we say, by a drone called a robot bomb, but actually it was by a drone. That's how he was killed. He was blown up after a 4 to 5 hour negotiation in which there was some talk that he might have a remote detonation device to blow up other things. Well, of course, these are things that one should not speculate on at all. And the reason that we had the discussion with LaRouche this morning, just to say, is that various people had contacted me over the course of the day before to discuss the matter, and they were distraught. And I said, well, the first thing is people should shut up. The first thing everybody should do is stop talking, because you have no idea whatsoever what happened. And the most important thing for everyone to do is to say nothing right now. Now, this, of course, is the kind of thing that offends unserious people. But when you come to a LaRouche meeting, or you start talking about Lyndon LaRouche as an intellect and his organization, we don't care about making friends and influencing people by making friends. I have the idea of not making friends and influencing people. We have the idea of telling truth, because truth is our friend. If truth is your friend, then that works. We can make that's fine. And so the important thing to say here is that what LaRouche had to say was that there's something being structured here. There is an actual mechanism, and Diane can actually quote it because she has his exact words, but that there's a mechanism that's been put in place. And so people are seeing something and it relates to real problems, like, for example, racism. a real problem in the United States, real problem among law enforcement, no question. Corruption in law enforcement. Oh yeah, that's a major problem as well. The introduction of military hardware, which had begun under Dick Cheney. That's a big problem too. But you know, there's another problem people would prefer not to point out. And that is the funding of Black Lives Matter by George Soros. And George Soros's Move On that also is involved with the Bernie Sanders campaign. See, people don't want to go there. They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about what George Soros is, his Open Society Fund, his Open Society's funding of the Ukraine war. They don't want to remember the incident of the snipers in the square in the Maidan in February, which snipers were, according to the Estonian foreign minister, later he basically tried to back off having said it, were not financed by the government or coming from the government, but from the protesters. And people were killed on both sides in the Maidan. Why is this significant? Well, because George Soros was the primary funder of Barack Obama. That's why. The primary funder of Barack Obama from when Barack Obama was running for his Senate campaign, the state Senate campaign in Illinois, when you didn't know who Barack Obama was. And he's also the person that during the period of October of, I believe that was 2006, November 2006, had his meeting in New York City, where he introduced Obama to various other people who were top financiers, and the person that became, at least in part, one of his managers, financial managers, for the campaign that happened during the period of 2007. Now, George Soros admits readily that he learned how to ply his trade as a young man in Nazi-occupied Hungary, where he assisted members of the Nazi command in procuring the property of Jews that had gone to the concentration camps. And he says that he learned how business practices should be conducted in part by his apprenticeship in Hungary. Yeah, in Nazi-occupied Hungary in 1944. Nobody wants to talk about these things, you see, but if you come here and you speak to us and you want to actually figure out what is actually going on in this country right now, well, we're not saying we know. I'm not saying by anything I just asserted that tells us what's happening in Dallas, but it tells us the following. What we are being told is happening in Dallas is not what's happening in Dallas. Just like what you were told happened in Orlando is not what happened in Orlando. Let's just talk about that for a moment. Now, the shooter in Orlando was employed by a thing called G4S Security Systems, one of the largest security firms in the world. Its American subsidiary was called Wackenhut Corporation. That's named after George Wackenhut, who, as an former FBI agent, who founded that company with 3 other FBI agents in 1951. What they specialized in was surveillance and files, and keeping files on people who they considered to be enemies of the state, communists and black radicals, and members of the civil rights movement. They assembled at one point in the 1960s files on 1 out of every 46 Americans. And these were private files. They inherited the files from the McCarthy Committee, from the House Un-American Activities Committee, and directly from McCarthy's committee. This is, we're talking now the late 50s and mid 60s into the late 60s. Then Wackenhut became one of the forefront companies involved in private security and the privatization of the American prisons. Now, private security means things like Blackwater and other such capabilities. But the reason I'm telling you all this, and I want to backtrack and stop myself because I think Mr. LaRouche at this point would intervene on me and say, wait a minute, keep on the point. The point is that G4S, which is a British firm, and this shooter was employed by them, and Wackenhut Corporation, which became a subsidiary of the British firm sometime in about 2002, I think. I think Wackenhut died in 2005 or 2006. But this is the FBI. It was founded in Florida. It's a Florida-based firm. The shooter's Florida. He's employed by G4S. Do we know what it means? Well, we know that Senator Graham of Florida is very upset about the FBI's withholding of 80,000 pages from him when he was in charge of the U.S. Senate Committee, Joint Investigative Committee, to look into 9/11, and he didn't get the pages at that time. 80,000 pages, not the 28 pages. So what we think happened in Orlando is not what happened. What we think happened in Boston at the marathon is not what happened. And what we think happened at 9/11 is not what happened. What we think happened in November 22nd, 1963 is not what happened. So when do the American people decide to set it right and recognize that when you look at Barack Obama, you look at the previous administration, the Bush administration, and you look at the successor candidates for the next one, that the entirety of what you're looking at is a tissue of lies, and that we, the American people, and the Manhattan Project in particular, have to play a certain decisive role, sounding a certain trumpet and a calm in a moment where people need to sit, deliberate, draw no conclusions, collect intelligence, find competent individuals that can actually carry out such an investigation, and meanwhile, focus on the kind of thing that you were referring to when you first got up about, the space program, the economy, many other things. Yes, but we are now, and at LaRouche's direct direction, we've launched an investigation. We are going to be doing this. This policy committee is going to be supervising it. And so there'll be more of a report at the point that we know more.
Hello, this is Howard, and I had to change my question because basically answered my first question, including about the potential bluff of NATO right now, and if they're going to go to war or not. But the other question I had that I was discussing with somebody close to me is the greeny shutdown of the electricity and productive economy in the wake of the COP21 or COP, whatever, the Paris Agreement. And that recently there's been proposed a law in Guatemala by the Convergence Bloc to stop all hydroelectric projects and all mining projects and take away the permits for some existing projects. And just as an example, and also in California, we have, because of a fire in an underground gas storage facility in the Los Angeles area, we have a possibility of massive blackouts this summer. So, and this is the same time that we have, as we noted in the recent conference, the Russians and the Chinese building nuclear power, building the One Belt, One Road project as a so-called win-win project for the world. So I just wanted to note that, and where are we going on these issues?
Well, I think you know where we're going on those, which is genocide if we go in that direction, because human beings cannot live at the standard of living we have, even in Guatemala or even in the US, without any energy. But I'm really glad you addressed this, because it does also, the question of China and Russia, it is absolutely the case that we in the United States are really clueless in terms of our thinking of the world. And if we would think of the world differently, we would have a better basis to understand what happened in Dallas, for example, recently. And by that, I mean, we in this country take two things for granted, which are not true. One is we think that we are the hegemonic power in the world, which we are not. Putin is the key strategist on the planet right now. Number two, we have grown to accept the idea that life, as we progress and for each generation, is going to get more difficult, that things are going to be more expensive, that you're going to have to live in smaller quarters with more people, use less energy, and be stupider. I mean, that's the so-called trend line, and that each generation will be more insane than the previous one. And actually, if we were not insane and had not been stupefied, if you think about the world what it looks like from the perspective of a student in China who a few months ago was watching a young woman astronaut on the space station give a class to millions of Chinese children on the ground about what it's like to be in a situation with no gravity, and what these children are thinking that their future is, which is their future is much brighter than their parents' future. And their lives are going to become easier as they age because of the progress that's being made in their nation. And somehow getting Americans to think about all these things that we take for granted as that somehow it has to be that way is simply not true. And I think this is the key back to the original point, that we have to reconsider our destiny, because the idea that we accept or tolerate the conditions that are being imposed upon us by the last two administrations and by Wall Street and the FBI is completely ridiculous. And there's absolutely no reason that we go along with this, and there's no necessity for it whatsoever. So I think it's useful that you brought these things up.
In order to situate my question, I just want to mention that we heard this morning that Helga LaRouche wants us to produce the pamphlet, a new pamphlet, which would contain the full proceedings of the conference that was held in Berlin. And I think that my question relates to a very a detail that came up in the course of that one of the speakers at the conference brought up, which I would just want to directly address. But I just also want to say in that connection that this will be a very powerful organizing tool, because I think at this particular juncture, people experiencing why that conference was so history-making, why it was so integral to the whole global process, is something that people should put themselves through. And more of it is actually in the latest issue of the EIR than with some more segments of it. But I don't know if other people had this reaction, but when I read the address by Dr. Shaban, the member of the Syrian presidency, I was really struck by how she described this situation where Syria's economy was growing, that over recent period, apparently under the presidency of Bashir al-Bashar, who is a quite different person than is characterized by the US media. They had actually experienced a situation where it's one of the only countries on the planet that had no foreign debt. They were investing in real physical economic growth. The economy was improving. They were providing free medical care, free education for everybody. Things were going in the right direction. And right at the juncture where the Obama-Hillary attack on Libya began, these human rights activists marched into the country and said, "You are not democratic," and created an environment where when the ISIS assault began, they were suddenly completely cut off from everybody in the world, that nobody would talk to them because they were quote unquote undemocratic. And that was what created the isolation and the environment in which this bloody massacre that was being supported by all kinds of different outside forces could gain so much power in such a short period of time. And when I read this, it created a flashback where I was also thinking about how even going back to the Reagan years, what a fight we had with these advocates of democracy as somehow the buzzword, one of the first of the buzzwords, which was supposed to characterize was supposed to organize people's minds to think that that's the dividing line in the world between democracy and dictatorship, that these are the two camps, and that those who are not democratic are in that other camp and they're enemies of society. And of course, this, was people like Oliver North and the National Endowment of Democracy and all kinds of psychos who were already destroying the democratic, who wouldn't support Reagan on the SDI, et cetera, who were grouped around this, as well as right-wing Republicans who were supporting Al-Qaeda. The label, the organizing label was democracy. And during the course of the week, I don't know what, it was actually very funny because several people were asking me over the phone, and I think this was mainly, I think most of these people were immigrant citizens. They're naturalized citizens. They were saying, I thought the United States was supposed to be a democracy. Why are we having this problem? So here it was coming up again in a different context. And I suddenly realized, Plato was right. Democracy leads to anarchy and tyranny. That's what it is. It's a rotten system. But just because you understand that doesn't mean that people understand what the actual solution to that problem is. And I've been saying to people over the past week, just because you can walk into a voting booth once every 2 years and pull a lever doesn't mean that you are in any way participating in the political system. That does not define freedom. That is not freedom. It's just it's a ritual unless it's embedded in something much, much deeper. Anyway, I wanted to bring this up in the context of the question of leadership. It's a difficult question to address, but I think that as part of this re-examining our, reassessing, recreating our sense of what our destiny is, that people have to really stand back and realize how ridiculous it has been that such a mantra could have been created in recent history, and that the issue is not what George Soros and company, it's not what is popularly called democracy, that the issue is something completely different. And I wonder if you would address that.
Dennis may have more, but my response as you're speaking is I was thinking the lever that people should be pressing is the one on the toilet.
Right. No, I think that's exactly the way to think. Helga LaRouche is a perfect example of leadership for this time and in our circumstance, because she's a German citizen. She is the founder of the Schiller Institute. She has collaborated with Lynn and LaRouche, particularly on what people today know as, they see it in the form of the BRICS process, but actually that process was born in the crucible of the days of 1988-89, when Lynn and LaRouche was being incarcerated. And he gave a memorable address in October of 1988, speaking about the idea that Germany should be unified and the Berlin Wall should come down, that there should be a joint project between East and West involving the Polish economy. And at the time that he did it, no one, virtually no one, even understood why he was giving that talk. And 1 year later, that event happened. Now, people then try to say, well, that was almost magical. Lynn LaRouche gets angry when you say that. No, he said that was just human. And the problem is that most of the rest of the thinking that people do is not human. So, for example, most of the talk about rights is not human. People are not discussing the qualifications to be human. What does it actually take? Are you just human just because you're born? So like, people believe I'm an American because I was born here. Are you? Do you even agree with what's in the Declaration of Independence? Do you know what's in the Declaration of Independence? So there's no notion that just being born automatically makes you human. Yes, it makes you human in the sense that your potentials are human potentials. But this issue of leadership and what Helga did and what has happened now, where we are now, as of today, with what we see with China and Russia, and the fact that America and Europe could adopt these policies, as Helga always says, instantly. And those nations, India also, and other nations would welcome the United States adopting these policies. But the problem is that the American people forgot to flush. And that's what we have to do. We have to dump Obama, okay? You dump these other policies. People have know the term taking a dump. That's the idea. Dump this, get rid of it. And that may occur if we continue to do the kind of job that LaRouche is asking us to do.
Okay. Well, there was 3 things recently that strategically have happened with the Chilcot report, the Brexit, and Erdogan apologizing to Putin and collaborating with Putin. And I think the tendency might be to think of each thing as a separate thing. And Helga had brought up that we had fully not understood the effects of what the Brexit had had on Europe. And I was wondering how we should be thinking about these things as one idea strategically.
Well, I mean, she made the point that people here don't fully appreciate the significance of what happened with the Brexit vote. And I will say, first of all, the formulation that the Brexit vote has caused a collapse is not correct. What has caused the collapse is the behavior of the transatlantic for about the last 50 years, and particularly since 2008, where what we did was to print money, and the printing of this money, it was like a tick on a small dog, because to print this money, you are literally sucking the blood out of the actual economy, which is investment in the space program, investment in rail, investment in energy, and the things that we would be doing. So the farce of this is that Obama's claims that we have a recovery because the stock market is up is actually an indication of how much we are in a collapse because of the collapse of the physical economy. But this vote was an inflection point. Also, as we discussed before, Mr. LaRouche and the Policy Committee, Obama contributed greatly to the Brexit vote by going over there to Britain and meeting with Cameron and giving a press conference where he said, well, of course, it's up to you on how to vote, but let me tell you what I think you should do. And everybody then ran in the other direction. Yes, did the opposite. But they could not keep it together, and the reverberations are still being felt. So the bank stocks are all dropping 5%, 10%, 30%. The pound has been at the lowest level ever. The real estate is getting wiped out. And frankly, anyone here who thinks that Wall Street somehow is not going to be affected or wiped out by the continuing consequences of this is out of their mind. And I am certain, because you don't hear all that much talk, the lack of discussion about the effects of the Brexit that we're seeing now in the Western press, there's, rumblings, only are masking the level of great hysteria underneath. So that on that. And I think this was one of the factors in Erdogan's decision. I don't think Erdogan is a nice guy, or that he decided he should just work with Putin because Putin is brilliant. Erdogan himself said that he really admired Adolf Hitler, and he's acted that way. So what's he looking at? He's looking at that the transatlantic is bankrupt, that Britain is not a member of the EU anymore, and they were the main pusher of a war against Russia, and who knows how much weight they're going to have in NATO, and that the strategic configuration, and what I think it was I forget if it was Mr. or Mrs. LaRouche who said that Putin was able to shape his meetings. That the whole point of his meeting with Netanyahu also contributed to his getting Erdogan to shift, right? So at any rate, there is a shift, and I would say it's similar, although different, to Japan. I mean, Prime Minister Abe is not the nicest guy in the world. He's a descendant of war criminals, and he goes and honors them at the ceremonies, you know. But he doesn't have an interest in Japan. And Japan is a small place. Japan will not survive if they're supposed to be a raw materials exporter or something like that. They don't have it. So Japan depends on a certain level of scientific progress. So what happened with Japan? Obama says, don't meet with Putin. And Abe goes to Sochi and meets with Putin. And Japan is now moving in the direction of the BRICS and Russia and China because it is in the interest of the nation of Japan to do so and to not be part of this bankrupt transatlantic system. So I would say that's kind of the shape of things. And again, we should really reflect here. Americans are looking in the wrong direction. Americans are looking to the elections to change something in the United States. And that's not what is changing the United States. What is changing the United States is what Putin is doing and what China is doing. And therefore, if the American people decided to act in concert with what those leaders are doing, it's a moment where it would be relatively easy to dramatically change the United States in ways that most of us can't even imagine.
I'm not going to, well, just the following, that people can get at the table, the EIR. I don't think we had this last week, which is the summary of our conference in Berlin that Helga organized. It's called Creating a Common Future for Mankind and a Renaissance of Classical Culture. Now, there's a reason not just to quote unquote get it. This is not a commercial from our sponsor. The concept here is, if you actually want an answer to what was asked, and I think it's an important question, this should be studied. This is one of the most important things you can do if you want to respond to the events in Dallas. Literally, if you want to actually understand what's going on, read this and read about this conference. Because what this will do is it will change your entire view of the world. And therefore, it will change your view of what's going on in Dallas. Because as Malcolm X once said, I have to go all the way around the world with you in order to make you understand what's going on right here. Okay, that's my comment.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. This is Jessica from Brooklyn, and I'm really glad that Dennis just said what he said, because it kind of clarifies things for me, and I'll let you know why. As you know, school ended on June 28th. And when school ended, I, being an ATR, which means that I'm a experienced substitute now, I go from school to school for certain periods of time and teach or fill in or cover teachers who are absent or there's some problem, whatever. At the end of the school year, I had amassed certain colleague friendships, acquaintances, that kind of thing. And then this past week, I was barraged with phone calls and people coming into certain places where I would be and telling me that they are being brought up on different charges. Now, I don't know how many people know here that I was brought up on charges from the DOE, the Department of Education, and this was 2 years ago. And my principal, who is a demon, brought up certain teachers on charges of incompetency, insubordination, misconduct, all of these things that had to do with us fighting for teachers' rights, not only in the union, but within our own schools. And that is something that they are not allowing us to do without retaliation. And so I fought, and many people in this organization, thank you very much, helped me through that. And now we're at a point where I guess people know that I fought and I refused to give up, and basically won what they're calling a wonderful victory and all of that, because I wasn't terminated. So the point is to terminate teachers who are 15 years plus, who have tenure, which means you have rights. They have to have probable cause to do these things to you. So tenure is a big deal. Who are at the top, or what they consider at the top of the salary chain, because principals don't want you on their budget. You cost too much. And you have experience with the children and with the parents. So my point is that when we talk about we're in a dark age, and I remember Mr. LaRouche talking about going into a dark age. It's not that the lights go out all over the planet. It's not that we have all of these shootings and we have the drought to contend with, and we have these people like Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, who is passing out vouchers for charter schools like it's candy. The dark age is connected to everything that's going on with people, the suicides, the shootings that we're talking about, the Dallas thing, and this attack on teachers, and all the other things that are connected to what causes us to die. And so I have been asked by so many people to help them through this, through these charges, through their situations, and the children are suffering from it. And I don't know if this has a direct, just bear with me, because it upsets me to see the children are really suffering from it. We're losing our good teachers, our experienced teachers. They want us to retire, or they want us to just die. So my point is that when I said to the teachers, what do you think is the cause of all this horror that's going on? Because they were giving me all types of one thing after another, complaint, upsetment. And I just kind of said, okay, what do you think is going on here? And they said, this was 3 teachers that came to me at one time. They said, I think they're trying to do us in. They're trying to destroy us. They're trying to kill us. And they don't want our children to prosper. And I said, yeah, you're right. And I switched it to, I'm in an organization where we just had a concert. We have concerts, and we bring in classical music, and we bring people together under a banner of progress and prosperity and uplifting through music. And you need to join our chorus. Now, Diane's going to say, I haven't even been to chorus like I should, but I'm coming back. Okay. So I got 3 people. I got 3 people's names that are promising to come to chorus, that really switched their entire idea. They were so downtrodden and so upset. And when I said this, it kind of changed the conversation, not away from the fact that I will help them, but towards the fact that there's still beauty in the world. There's still things that they can do. There's still things that we need to not be pessimistic about. And I just wanted to bring that here today and talk about this connection between all these things that are happening that are causing a real dark age, and how to bring people out of it, how we can bring people out of it. And it takes one person. It takes all of us, and I don't know what else to say. I hope you see where I'm going with this. But that's what I wanted to talk about. Thank you.
I'll just say a couple things about it. Just The chorus point is I think the crucial one, because the process you're describing is happening. It has a lot to do with what Lyndon LaRouche describes and others know as the green policy. You see, when you have a society in which you're talking about how everything is limited because people are bad, there are too many people, too few resources, and you continue to teach that to people over a period of 40 years, young people begin to believe that that's the way the world is. Therefore, there's no reason that they should stick around for a future. But more importantly, the process of extermination of teachers is exactly what is going on. It always happens in societies that are destroying themselves. That's what happened to Socrates in Athens. It was a process that was going on earlier than Socrates, very much earlier. And Greece never recovered to this day from what was done with that process. LaRouche is the same thing. The poet Shelley says at the end of his defense of poetry that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Right now, Lyndon LaRouche is the unacknowledged head of the United States. It's not acknowledged by people, but what's happening is that he and Helga are campaigning all over the world. They did something with the Russians. Lyndon's been a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences since 1993. Some of us were at the official ceremony that happened in 1994 at a conference in Washington, D.C., where the Russians came there and he was made officially a member of that. There's a reason they did that. And I'm not going to go through details. I think people are aware of what Lynn did with the SDI and some other things. And some people have some sense, at least, of his ongoing dialogue with people at the forefront of science and economics in that nation. It's also true in China. Helga, more in China, who's called the Silk Road Lady, she's given correctly credit for being the person that has the patents on what we today call the Silk Road. The Chinese say that about her, but she's not acknowledged in Germany that way. So what you're dealing with is the principle that Shelley described, that his point was that it doesn't matter whether or not you acknowledge the poet as the unacknowledged legislator. That's where the laws come from. Just as in the case of Athens, Solon of Athens created the laws and the Constitution through a poem in the 7th century BC. So what we're talking about, we can go on like that. You know, the issue is what they're doing to you, what they've done in New York. Yes, of course they're trying to exterminate teachers, because teachers try to convey ideas. And ideas have been exterminated, especially in the recent presidential election, where there is never any idea ever discussed by the candidates. The ideas only come in if one of our people happens to intervene on Hillary Clinton, for example, and then there's a certain response, a reaction to that, as Daniel Burke did around the issue of Glass-Steagall, or you get something like what we did to Tony Blair, what you did to Tony Blair last week. Now you see what's happening with Tony Blair this week. These things are not unrelated. It's not because you literally did it, but it's a poetic issue. It's what's in, Schiller has a poem called The Cranes of Ibycus, in which he describes this precise process. This is the power of poetry. This is also why Lyndon LaRouche, and I hope he won't be too angry at my earlier first statement, he always insists you must place your voice, speak calmly, speak directly, modulate. Because what he's saying is that the presentation of an idea is as important as the content of the idea. He called that at one point, the content of policy is the method by which it is made. It's sort of an interesting thing to think about, huh? Because which is a different idea, but it's related. This is the problem of our country. People are babbling. People are accepting babble as though ideas are being exchanged. Huh? You remember this from the famous Obama Hope and Change campaign. You couldn't figure out what was being said. So several of us said we had philosophical doubts about the existence of Barack Obama at the time. We couldn't figure out what was being said. People were yelling, screaming, they were happy. Nothing was ever being said. And now we're in this 8 years later. It's even worse. But the issue involved is different. The issue is that we have to realize that there is a power, and that power which LaRouche, remember, Lynn started the Manhattan Project and made it a dialogue. He just can't be with us today. He does everything he can to be here every Saturday and to make sure he's leading a process that he understands of how to change how people think about how to think. That's the way he tries to direct all of his remarks. I don't think many of us, like myself, do as good a job or anything like that. The relevant point is he really thinks past 4 or 5 steps past what your conclusions are all the time. But his point is that if you want to think in a human way, you have to think about the future. Teachers are all about that. That's why they're attacked, because there is to be no future for the United States. The green policy talks about no future. There's no solution. There's not a man-made solution that increases progress, increases wealth, and increases people. That more people are needed. The world needs more people. And the universe needs more people. This is in doubt. Well, if that's in doubt in your society, then your society is morally unfit to survive and won't. It will self-destruct. And so the folly of our time is leaving people like Obama in some kind of position of power or authority. That's why we have to dump him. This is not, personal with respect to Obama, because it's questionable whether he's a person. The issue is that it's not. It's not, or Bush or any of the others. This is a different question. It's a question of who are we? Are we people or not? And so this is, I think, what you're expressing, and this is what we stand for. That's what the chorus work is. And I think maybe Diane will say something about the ad directly. But I'm glad you had that exchange with the people, and that was the change you saw when you addressed them that way.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is Inola McGuire. Well, I have one simple question, and it has to do with why do you think most African Americans vote for the Democratic Party?
Because they don't want to vote for the Republican Party. That's all I can come up with. Anyway, but I do want to say a couple things, and now that you've asked that question, and in response to Jessica and what we have to do here, which you can help with. One of the things I discussed with Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche today is a petition which the LaRouche Policy Committee is going to have written by the end of this weekend on the question of the truth on 9/11, not merely the 28 pages, but why isn't there an investigation which leads to results like Bush, Cheney, and Obama are all brought up on charges and out of power. Because I have a sense with and that was the third thing that Jared raised, which I was trying to remember, the Chilcott Commission and Tony Blair, which is another thing that I think people are underestimating. This guy is done. He is really done. You should see the front pages of every single newspaper in Britain. Like the thing I read you, Tony Blair is damned. And you have families now who want to sue him for damages for their children being killed in this war. Only 179 Britons died in Iraq compared to, I forget what we're up to now, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 Americans who were killed, not to mention how many hundreds of thousands Iraqis were killed and others, and for something that was not necessary, which is why this is a Nuremberg crime. But the point is, this is now out in public. And Mrs. LaRouche had made the point that you get justice, or Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, that we don't know when we will get justice, but we know that justice will occur. And I have an image, Dennis referenced the cranes of Ibycus, and I don't know if people know what we're referring to when we say the Erinyes, because what happened in the poem is this very beloved poet, Ibycus, was coming to a big poetry festival in the Colosseum, or an amphitheater, maybe it looked like Palmyra, and he was attacked and murdered on the lonely road on his way to this festival. And the crowd was very upset. They didn't know where he was, why he wasn't there, and then the word came back, his body, he was dead. And there was a kind of horror in the crowd. And what Schiller described are these Erinyes, which are almost like ghosts or wailing creatures that went wailing around this theater, which is a kind of tension. You know, you can imagine your hair standing on end with this shrieking, Ibycus was murdered, he was murdered, he was murdered, this kind of whisper and the horror. And then just at that moment, and when Ibycus died, I should say, there was no one around, no one, he called for help, there was no one, but his last breath, there was a flock of cranes flying overhead. So he called out to the cranes as they flew over in the sky, avenge me, you're all I have, to the cranes. So, and then he died. So you have these Erinyes shrieking and wailing and creating this unbelievable tension in this crowd. And just at that moment, this flock of cranes flies over the crowd, and someone in the crowd says, "The cranes of Ibycus." And everyone says, "Oh, you are the killer." He gave himself away. And my image is that we can create an Erinyes-like tension in Manhattan, both with the petition and the process leading into the series of performances of Mozart's Requiem, which will be on the anniversary of the September 11th attacks, because the process of engaging people in something which is noble and which is beautiful, because when you say justice, when we say justice, you don't mean revenge. In other words, would it be just for us to go and wipe Saudi Arabia off the map? Not really. There's plenty of people in Saudi Arabia who probably had nothing to do with this. There are people in Saudi prisons. There are people that the Saudi royal family is going to be beheading next year who don't deserve that fate. So our acting in the same manner as the people who did this is not justice. So the question of justice has a higher purpose, which means that you create the conditions for the evil that occurred to not occur again, that you lift mankind up to a higher level. And you want to create by the work that we're doing over these months in Manhattan in particular, because there's no place in the nation, even though the Pentagon was hit and people in DC were devastated, but there's no place in the nation where you have as many people in a concentrated area as were directly affected by the 9/11 attacks and affected to this very day, and are still dying, whether it's in these lying illegal wars or whether it's first responders who got all kinds of lung diseases and cancer and everything else from working in the debris. So that we're addressing a crime which is ongoing. And I consider San Bernardino, Orlando, Dallas, I consider these things to be part of the crime of 9/11, because since the truth has not been brought out in that, there is a certain dynamic which is at work here in the United States. So the idea of us in this room over these months leading into the 15th anniversary of 9/11 is that we will create this Irenes-like tension in the city of Manhattan, which will cause our enemies to destroy themselves. And that's what everyone here can be involved in, and the chorus is the crucial part of that. That's what I have.
I wanted to, this is John from New Jersey, go back to where you started on this, what Mr. LaRouche said, that the Manhattan Project is ready to be used now, and it should be used now. And you know what Renee was talking about on this question of democracy that comes up a lot, and I don't think you know, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. I think it's more what FDR said, what is democracy really? And that in fact, this is a thread in our country's history, that democracy is leadership. And democracy is not, okay, I have a powerful idea and I'm going to do what I can to implement it. It's, I have a powerful idea to, and I'm going to uplift the population that it become done. And you see that, well, Hamilton, I think is one of the best examples, because that's what the Federalist Papers was. And just the last couple of years before he died, he was involved in creating something called the Christian Constitutional Society, where to set up a network and kind of an intelligentsia around the country to monitor and respond to the you know, the loyalists, et cetera, and their subterfuge, Lincoln-Douglas debates and other things, the Gettysburg Address. You know, you're winning the population over to a higher idea. And FDR's fireside chats, you know, this kind of thing. And it reminds me of what Lynn used to say about, you know, our power is their reason. And I could think you could say our democracy is their reason. So there's a process, and it's exactly what these town meetings every Saturday are doing. So when Lynn said, well, I think the Manhattan Project is ready to be used now, and here in 8 or 9 weeks, we're going to do the Requiem. The Requiem memorial concerts are not what we're doing on that day, but it's what we've been doing for the last 2 years, carrying all of this dialogue forward, which has, I think, resonated throughout New York in various ways through our activity and our discussions. Anyway, that's what I was thinking. I just because I think this whole question of democracy is sort of belittled, or I don't know what the right word is, but it is something that's real, and the democracy of the mob, the masses, is the enemy's view, is to dumb down, stupefy, and they're taking away people's humanity, and so they get their result that way. Whereas through, you know, what we're doing is we're giving people their power of reason and passion to intervene in the world. That you only do it as a nation, as a movement, as a society, even though it requires and depends upon the leadership of individuals to come up with the higher conceptions.
Yeah, I'll just say something here. A good example of this is Frederick Douglass, because Douglass, in his battle to assert his humanity, had no problem engaging in physical conflict to do that. But he also had no problem in becoming one of the nation's great orators in advocating humanity against the notion of bestiality. Also, what happened was that in the 1840s, he broke with the abolitionists of Boston, who he realized were saying that if you need to divide the United States in order to stop slavery, just abolish slavery in the North and leave the South, that should be done. And Douglas said, no, that should not be done. What should be done is that slavery should be ended, period, everywhere. And what happened was that he had to leave Boston, and he went to Rochester, New York, and established his newspaper, the North Star, the Northern Star, right, the North Star, as a constitutionalist against the Boston abolitionists. This created some tension at one point, even particularly with John Brown, who came to see Douglas just before the famous raid. And Douglas tried to convince him, not merely that the raid was not going to be successful, which was one thing, but that the entire method was wrong. And it is Douglas that's responsible, through a constant petitioning of Lincoln, to getting 200,000 plus African-American troops into the war. His son serves in the war. That's why Lincoln does what he does in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. This is something that is not only because of Douglas, but the relevant element is what then occurred as a result of this collaboration was that when Lincoln gave his famous second inaugural, the first person he asked about it was Frederick Douglass, who was there. The very first person, the person that he was interested in the opinion was, what did Douglas think of the speech? And that's a useful thing to look at, because the second inaugural is, as is the Gettysburg Address, a very eloquent statement of the problem of nemesis. It's a very eloquent statement of it. So when we talk about democracy, here's a good example, if we want to look at it from the standpoint of the citizen who is self-educated not merely because, of course, it was Douglas's, the wife of the slave master that helped him to learn how to read. There's an important thing to understand about the United States in this regard. And in his example, of course, is then made really concrete in the form of his grandson, Joseph Douglas, the violinist, the classical violinist who travels with his grandfather in 1892 to the Chicago Exposition, where they're about to have a coon show, sort of as a way of trying to denigrate Black Americans in that particular exposition. And Douglas shows up with Paul Laurence Dunbar, himself, and his son Joseph Douglas. Dvorak had just gotten to America, so he wasn't there. But this became the generating point through Burleigh's discussions with Dvorak about his father's involvement at the Underground Railroad, and with Douglas's networks in Rochester and Buffalo. So that is how the collaboration with Burleigh and Dvorak on the question of the spirituals, that comes out of this same tradition. So when I think the way to think about how these things work, rather than the terms, because often people will get themselves freaked out or concerned, democracy versus republicanism versus this versus that. The personage of Douglas, in contrast, for example, to the quasi-personage of Barack Obama, or Bush, or Cheney, or Sanders, or I can name any number of people. This is a person who represented the highest expression of humanity and faith in the Constitution. Now, every July 4th, if you check, people take this speech from Douglas. What to the Black American is your 4th of July? What to the slave is your 4th of July? They take a section out of a speech, which Douglas gave on July 5th. And Douglas talks about how this is all about hypocrisy. They never will take the full speech. And I won't go through. I happen to have had an argument with some people in Vermont about precisely this 2 weeks ago at a particular center in Vermont, where they were saying they're going to recite the speech. The beginning of the speech is very clear about the founders and the extraordinary gift of the U.S. Constitution. The purpose of the speech is to say that what the founders did is not fulfilled. The purpose is completely the opposite of the way that it's used every 4th of July, which is as a denunciation of the Declaration of Independence. That's how it's used right now. And so this is why this issue that you're bringing up, or is brought up also by Renee and you, is of relevance, but we need to place it in its proper perspective, particularly today, particularly because of what people think has gone on in Dallas. Because what is going on in Dallas today is not appreciably different in its character to what went on November 22nd, 1963. And people have to decide that they're going to think freely, okay? And then we have to uplift our citizens, yes, away from where they are right now, away from their crazy or emotional responses, no matter what they are, to think about what the true system of American self-government is. And then we have to act on that. We're going to make you the last question. I think that's all we have anyway.
Thank you, Dennis. I don't have a fully formed question, but just some thoughts in terms of, for the brief time I've been here, listening to John's question, Jessica's comments, and Inala's question, and your responses to them. And I'm reminded again why, in I think most people's minds, and being the exact 400th year of his death, William Shakespeare is, in my mind, the king of kings, you know, and the genius of geniuses in terms of looking at the world, looking at these situations, and so forth. First of all, with Inala's question, I think, and many of us in the room, I'm sure that when she asked her question about, well, why do African Americans vote for the Democratic Party? And immediately FDR, of course, came to mind. And it brings, I think, together the whole idea of everything that everyone's been talking about, particularly Lynn with immortality, the idea of the universe being good, and by virtue of being good, these actions have a residual effect. I mean, a lot of people may say, well, the Kennedys, because most people, or maybe people, you know, today have a better frame of reference, having been alive, many people, when the Kennedys were around. But I think many of us know as well that Eleanor Roosevelt spoke to the Kennedys and said, if you want to be president, if you want to be real American leaders, you need to understand and do what, in fact, my husband did, what he was acting on. And of course, you know, John F. Kennedy wrote, you know, one of his college papers on the American system, and he really extolled those virtues. So I was thinking of that with Inala's question. Now with Jessica talking about, and then Dennis's, your response with the future being killed off, and that's the way, if you want to defeat humanity, to get people to think. I immediately went to Hamlet, and with your commentary, Diane, about the cranes of Ibycus and the Erinyes and so forth, avenge me. And of course, that's at the beginning of the play what Hamlet's father, the ghost, the idea of the father's immortal impact on his son, you know, that's what he says, avenge me. And then of course, Hamlet doesn't understand that. He says, my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth, which is the exact same thing, whether people are out on the street organizing or whether people are talking at some kind of political rally or whatever it is, that the idea of not denouncing people in the sense of having that rage or that vengeance or that anger that consumes you, because as Schiller, I think, also mentions in his famous poem To Joy, the idea is to lift people up. Don't kick your enemy when they're down, but inspire them. So I immediately, you know, was thinking about Hamlet and the idea that, you know, in the graveyard scene, at the beginning of Act 5, he looks at the skull of Julius Caesar. He looks at the skull of he looks at skulls and he prospects if this is Julius Caesar, is this Alexander the Great, you know, and what are they worth now? They're just smelly dirt. They can stop up a beer barrel. They can stop up a wall, you know, in a house to keep the wind out. And it's clear that that's just the culmination of Hamlet completely missing the idea of his human ability to act for the future, to impact these things. And it just led me to thinking even further that the idea to identify that is fine, but if you're really going to, I guess if I'm really going to understand Shakespeare and the people I teach it to, or the people that we teach it to when we talk about it, it's not just stopping there. The question is to ask, what's really the nature of the tragedy in order to avoid it? So how do you not be that Hamlet, and what's missing from Hamlet's mind that he doesn't see himself as able to act because he knows he has a responsibility. He admonishes himself. He sits and sits and sits and ponders and ponders and ponders, but because there's no solution, he ponders until he decides he wants to kill himself because he convinces himself that there is nothing he can do because all the predicates he had in advance were wrong from the beginning. So just in the sense of, I guess, looking at maybe Shakespeare's greatest play in that sense, it's really about what's going on now, it seems. So those were just, some thoughts from, I think, the last 3 questions and responses. And thank you.
I think it's actually not exactly the right question because it's not about Hamlet. And my answer to you is going to be from another play, an opera, Don Giovanni, which LaRouche talks about a lot, did talk about a lot at one time, because people who may or may not know the stories, you have this character, Don Giovanni, and the famous song Mille Tre. He had managed to conquer 1,003 women. And he had a friend who kept a book of all this. And then what happens, and people think that this is the end, which is the deceased father who he's killed of one of the women that he's trying to rape, comes back and says, you're gonna atone. I want you to have dinner with me. And Giovanni's very, jocular and so on, and refuses to. And then what happens is the dinner time arrives, the commendatory is there, Don Giovanni shows up and he gets swallowed up in hell. The flames come up and gets swallowed up, but that's not the end. Because the next scene is, I think it's a wedding, it's the whole town, everybody he's with, and what are they doing? Business as usual. They're just going along their lives exactly as they were before they got this, what you think would have been a lesson, which is the guy gets swallowed up in hell and maybe we should change our behavior. And they completely ignore that and go along with their degenerate selves. And I think that's the challenge to us, why Friedrich Schiller wrote the aesthetical letters, the letters on aesthetical education, as he said, when the French Revolution came, a great moment has found a little people. And I think that's the challenge for us here, as not simply individuals, but as a group, as a body, as a chorus.
I'd just like to say, as we're closing, that we take a look at what we're dealing with here today. LaRouche was very concerned, correctly, that we stay on point, and we've done that. I think that the importance is to understand that you have a process in the United States that can be removed, and that's Barack Obama. And that process, which is personified by Obama, is the province of every citizen, particularly those in New York City, to change. Now, Helga wanted to make sure that we didn't sink into a focus on America, what we think is the American crisis. It's a global crisis. It's a transatlantic crisis. And that there has a crisis which is occurring within a box, and surrounding the box is the solution. And that solution is what she and Lynn and others have worked on, and what Putin in particular from a strategic standpoint exemplifies. Why that's important is that the actions outside of that box, which is largely merely a mental box, it's not a real box. The Americans do not have to act as though they are part of the valley of the clueless. And just to say, in terms of particularly how this might work, is referencing what Diane just said. You know, Beethoven was a great admirer of Mozart, but he was not a great admirer of Don Giovanni. And so he decided he wanted to see something different. He created an opera called Fidelio, and the core character in that, there are two really, they're really one but two. They're one person really, Florestan and Leonora. And Florestan has been placed in jail. He's a political prisoner. And his wife comes to free him. This is based on the actual story of Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette. But Beethoven creates a solution where out of the jail itself, he's lifted. And Florestan sings an important aria in which he sees his liberation coming to him before it happens. He has foresight. He has an idea of the future, and that idea is what keeps him alive and has kept him alive. His wife doesn't really know that he's necessarily there. She believes he may be. And when she hears of the plot to kill the prisoner, as she's there digging his grave with Rocco, the jailer, and the plot is revealed to her, she says, "Whoever you are, I'm going to free you." And therefore it's her husband. The important thing here is we don't have a problem freeing the United States from the plague that Barack Obama is simply the last expression of, the latest expression of. It's a British plague. The United States has never, even since 1763, really ever been fully free of it. The world has not. And that is what we're on the verge of doing right now. And we can fulfill what Alexander Hamilton created the basis for us to do. The LaRouche Policy Committee, as Diane already said, is going to take this up. This is the task. There'll be a discussion with Lynn by tomorrow. The Policy Committee will be discussing this more tonight. And I would just ask that everyone here change your plans for the next 48 hours. Be available to us, be on alert. We're going to call you, or you should call us, to find out how we intend to deploy and in what fashion to bring to justice this entire grouping, including Obama, in what they are now perpetrating in the streets of the United States, as they are perpetrating that around the world, in Syria and other locations. So I think you should change your plans.